A civilian ship was moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Not a destroyer, not an aircraft carrier, not a military supply vessel. A cargo ship. The kind of ship most people never think about, but every modern economy depends on. It carried ordinary goods, moving through one of the most important maritime corridors on Earth. Then a drone hit it. The windows on the bridge shattered. The crew survived. The ship did not sink. And because it kept moving, many people treated the incident like a limited strike, a warning shot, a small escalation. But that is exactly the mistake, because this was not really about one ship. It was about who controls the Strait of Hormuz. It was about whether Iran can rewrite the rules of global shipping after a ceasefire. And it was about whether America is still able to enforce the system it claims to protect. Within 24 hours, the United States struck Iranian targets again. Missile storage sites, drone facilities, coastal radar positions. Washington called it a response to aggression against commercial shipping. Tehran called it another attack during negotiations. And suddenly, the ceasefire that had been celebrated only days earlier looked like it was already beginning to break. But this time, the crisis is different, because Iran is not simply firing back in anger. It is testing something much bigger. It is testing whether a country can lose a conventional war, suffer massive damage, and still walk away with leverage over the most important oil route in the world. That is the real story. Not the drone, not the ship, not even the American strike. The real story is the battle over the rules after the war. Who decides which ships can pass? Who decides which route is safe? Who controls the information? Who gets to say this corridor is legal and that corridor is dangerous? For decades, the answer was simple. The United States Navy kept the Strait of Hormuz open. Iran could threaten. Iran could warn. Iran could harass ships. But the basic order remained unchanged. Oil moved. Gas moved. Fertilizer moved. And the world economy assumed the waterway would remain open. Now that assumption has been broken. The drone strike exposed something deeper than a security failure. It showed that the ceasefire stopped the shooting, but it did not settle the power struggle. And when a ceasefire leaves the most important question unanswered, the war does not truly end. It only changes form. So the question now is not whether the United States can hit Iran. Of course it can. The question is whether those strikes can restore the old order. Because if Iran has proved that the Strait of Hormuz can no longer operate without taking Tehran seriously, then the map of global trade has changed. And that is why one damaged cargo ship may become one of the most important symbols of this entire crisis. To understand why this incident matters, you first have to understand one place, the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow stretch of water separating Iran from Oman. In some areas, it's only a few dozen kilometers wide, but appearances can be deceiving. This small corridor is one of the most valuable pieces of geography on the planet. Before the latest conflict erupted, nearly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil traded worldwide passed through these waters. Massive LNG shipments crossed it every day. Chemical products, industrial materials, agricultural supplies, container ships carrying goods destined for factories, supermarkets, and hospitals. A disruption here doesn't stay here, it spreads. An incident in the Strait of Hormuz can raise fuel prices in Europe, increase transportation costs in Asia, and push inflation higher across continents that are thousands of miles away. That is why governments monitor this waterway almost around the clock. But for Iran, the strait has never been just an economic route. It has always been a strategic weapon. Iran understands something that military planners have known for generations. A country doesn't always need the world's largest army to influence global politics. Sometimes controlling a critical location is enough. If you cannot defeat a stronger opponent directly, you increase the cost of confronting you. And that is exactly what the Strait of Hormuz represents. For decades, Iranian leaders have repeated the same message in different forms. If Iran cannot export its oil safely, others should not assume they can either. Sometimes those warnings remain political rhetoric. Other times they were backed by naval exercises, fast attack boats, drone activity, or temporary disruptions to commercial shipping. Most of the time, however, the international system absorbed the pressure. The U.S. Navy maintained a constant presence. Commercial traffic continued. Insurance companies adjusted premiums. Markets calmed down. Life moved on. But the recent war changed something fundamental. For the first time in years, Iran demonstrated that it could create real uncertainty inside this critical waterway, not permanent control. Not complete closure, but enough disruption to remind the world how vulnerable global trade really is. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot easily be forgotten. Shipping companies remember. Insurance firms remember. Energy traders remember. Governments remember. Even after missiles stop flying, the memory of risk remains. That is why the latest drone strike created so much anxiety. The physical damage was relatively limited. The symbolic damage was much greater because it suggested that commercial vessels could once again become part of a geopolitical contest. The Ever-Lovely was not chosen because it carried military equipment. It represented something far more important: normal commerce. The assumption that civilian shipping can pass through one of the world's busiest trade routes without becoming a target. Once that assumption begins to weaken, every company using the strait starts asking difficult questions. Should we continue using this route? Should we pay higher insurance costs? Should we delay shipments? Should we look for alternatives? Those decisions affect far more than one voyage. They affect supply chains worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And that is exactly why the battle over the Strait of Hormuz has never been only about geography. It is about leverage. Because whoever shapes the rules governing this narrow passage influences far more than ships. They influence the global economy itself. When the ceasefire was announced, financial markets reacted almost immediately. Oil prices eased. Shipping companies cautiously resumed operations. Diplomats congratulated themselves. Television networks spoke about a breakthrough. From the outside, it looked as though the crisis had finally been contained. But appearances can be misleading. The ceasefire stopped the fighting. It did not settle the argument that had caused much of the conflict in the first place. In reality, both Washington and Tehran walked away from the agreement, believing they had protected their own interests. And that is often how fragile peace begins. Each side reads the same document differently. Each side believes time will eventually prove its interpretation correct. For the United States, the objective was straightforward: reduce military tensions, reopen international shipping, allow commercial traffic to move freely once again, restore confidence in one of the world's most important trade routes. From Washington's perspective, the Strait of Hormuz should eventually return to operating the way it had before the war: international shipping, international navigation, no country exercising unilateral control over civilian vessels. Iran saw the agreement very differently. Tehran believed the war had fundamentally changed the balance of power. Its leaders argued that the old system no longer reflected reality. After months of confrontation, they believed Iran deserved a greater role in determining how navigation inside the strait would function. That difference may sound technical. It is anything but, because both sides were discussing the same waterway while imagining two completely different futures. One future preserved the previous international system. The other created a new regional order, where Iran exercised far greater influence over commercial navigation. Those visions cannot easily coexist. Soon, another disagreement emerged. Not over missiles, not over sanctions, but over shipping routes. International maritime authorities, working alongside regional partners, supported navigation corridors designed to maximize safety for commercial vessels. Iran objected. Tehran argued that any long-term arrangement affecting navigation near its coastline could not simply ignore Iranian security concerns. Officials warned that routes established without proper coordination increase the risk of confrontation. Whether one agrees with Iran's position or not is almost beside the point. The important fact is this: Iran was no longer behaving like a country that believed the war had settled the issue. It was behaving like a country determined to renegotiate the rules after the battlefield had gone quiet. That changes everything, because once legal disagreements become operational disputes, every commercial voyage becomes politically significant. A tanker is no longer just carrying oil. It becomes a statement about which rules are being recognized. A cargo vessel is no longer just transporting goods. Its chosen route becomes part of a much larger geopolitical contest. This explains why the latest drone incident attracted so much attention. It wasn't simply another attack. It challenged the assumption that the ceasefire had restored a stable system. Instead, it exposed something diplomats had hoped to postpone. The central dispute had never actually been resolved. It had only been delayed. And history offers countless examples of what happens when peace agreements postpone the hardest questions instead of answering them. Those questions eventually return, sometimes across negotiating tables, sometimes through economic pressure, and sometimes through another confrontation at sea. At first glance, the latest American airstrikes looked familiar. Iranian facilities were hit, military infrastructure was targeted. Washington described the operation as a limited response, designed to protect international shipping and deter future attacks. On paper, it followed a pattern the world has seen many times before: a strike, a warning, a promise of stronger action if necessary. But beneath the military response lies a much more complicated problem. Because missiles can destroy launch sites, they cannot resolve competing interpretations of the rules. That is where this crisis becomes far more dangerous than previous confrontations. The United States continues to argue that international waterways belong to the international community. Commercial vessels should move freely. No regional power should decide which ships pass and which do not. That principle has guided global maritime trade for decades. Without it, international commerce becomes unpredictable. Insurance costs explode. Shipping schedules collapse. Energy markets become unstable. Iran views the situation through an entirely different lens. From Tehran's perspective, geography cannot simply be ignored. Iran borders the strait. Its coastline stretches along one side of the waterway. Its security establishment believes that any system governing navigation must reflect that reality. The leadership argues that foreign powers have spent decades making decisions in waters that directly affect Iran's national security, while expecting Tehran to simply accept the outcome. Whether that argument convinces the rest of the world is another matter, but understanding it explains why negotiations remain so difficult. Because both sides believe they are defending legitimate principles. Washington believes it is protecting freedom of navigation. Tehran believes it is defending sovereign security interests. Those positions overlap very little. And when two governments begin from completely different assumptions, even identical words can carry different meanings. That is exactly what happened after the ceasefire. American officials believe commercial shipping had returned to internationally accepted rules. Iranian officials believe a new post-war arrangement was still being negotiated. The same agreement, two completely different expectations. The drone strike exposed that gap. It forced both interpretations into direct collision. Suddenly, lawyers became almost as important as generals. Maritime regulations mattered almost as much as military deployments. Every statement issued by diplomats was analyzed as carefully as satellite images of missile sites. Because this was no longer only a military confrontation, it had become a struggle over legitimacy. Who has the authority to define acceptable navigation? Who decides which shipping corridor is recognized? Who determines whether a military response is defensive or provocative? These questions have no easy battlefield solution, and that is why Washington responded with airstrikes while simultaneously leaving diplomatic channels open. The objective was not simply to punish Iran. It was also to prevent one dangerous precedent from taking hold. If commercial vessels begin accepting different navigation rules depending on who has the strongest military presence on a given day, the entire architecture of global maritime trade begins to weaken. That possibility worries governments far beyond the Middle East, because today's dispute may be unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz. But tomorrow, similar questions could emerge in other strategic waterways around the world. And that is why this confrontation is being watched so closely by capitals thousands of miles away. For many governments, this is no longer just an Iranian-American dispute. It is becoming a test case for how global trade will function in an increasingly contested world. Many people assume Iran's greatest strength is its missile arsenal. Others point to its drone program. Some focus on the Revolutionary Guard. Those capabilities certainly matter, but they are not Tehran's most valuable asset. Iran's greatest advantage cannot be manufactured, it cannot be sanctioned, it cannot be destroyed from the air. It is geography. Unlike military equipment, geography survives every war. Governments change, presidents come and go, generals are replaced, but mountains remain, coastlines remain, strategic waterways remain. And the Strait of Hormuz will remain exactly where it is long after today's leaders have disappeared from the political stage. Iran understands this better than almost anyone. Military victories can be temporary. Economic sanctions can be lifted. Political alliances can shift. Geography does not negotiate. That is why Tehran has spent decades building a strategy around one simple reality. If Iran cannot become the strongest military power in the region, it can still become the most difficult country to ignore. Think about what happened after the latest ceasefire. Iran did not immediately try to defeat the United States on the battlefield. Instead, it challenged something much more valuable: predictability. Global commerce depends on one assumption above almost everything else. Businesses need certainty. Shipping companies need to know where they can sail. Energy markets need confidence that supplies will arrive on schedule. Insurance companies need stable risk calculations. Investors need predictable trade routes. The moment uncertainty enters that system, the costs begin rising almost immediately. Not because thousands of ships are suddenly destroyed, but because every company starts preparing for the possibility that they might be. Insurance premiums increase. Shipping delays become more common. Alternative routes are explored. Contracts become more expensive. Financial markets begin pricing risk into every shipment. This is where Iran gains leverage, not because it controls every ship, but because it can influence how everyone thinks about the possibility of disruption. In international politics, perception often becomes as powerful as reality. If global markets believe a vital trade route is becoming unstable, economic consequences begin long before any formal closure occurs. That is exactly why the latest drone strike mattered so much. The physical damage was relatively limited. The psychological impact was far greater. One damaged cargo vessel reminded the entire shipping industry that the Strait of Hormuz remains contested. And once confidence begins to weaken, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult. This explains why Tehran continues linking military pressure with diplomatic negotiations. The objective is not endless conflict. Conflict is expensive for Iran as well. The objective is influence. Iran wants every future negotiation about Gulf security to begin with one unavoidable fact. Nothing important can happen in the Strait of Hormuz without considering Tehran's position. Whether the international community accepts that argument remains uncertain. But Iran has already achieved something significant. It has forced the conversation to happen. And in geopolitics, compelling stronger nations to negotiate on your terms is often a form of power in itself. That may be Iran's greatest achievement since the fighting began. Not winning the war, but ensuring that the post-war order can no longer be designed without its participation. From Washington's perspective, remaining silent was never a realistic option. Imagine the message that would have been sent if a commercial cargo ship were struck in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes and the United States chose not to respond. The consequences would have reached far beyond the Persian Gulf. Every American ally would begin asking the same question. If Washington won't defend international shipping here, where else might it hesitate? That is why the military response came so quickly. The airstrikes were aimed at more than Iranian military facilities. They were aimed at restoring credibility. In international politics, credibility is a form of power. Countries don't only evaluate what a superpower says, they evaluate whether its promises carry consequences. For decades, the United States has presented itself as a primary guarantor of freedom of navigation, not just in the Middle East, but across the world's oceans. That role comes with enormous responsibilities. Whenever a major shipping route is threatened, expectations immediately shift toward Washington. Friends expect protection. Competitors watch for hesitation. Financial markets look for reassurance. This means American leaders often face an uncomfortable dilemma. Respond too weakly, and deterrence begins to fade. Respond too aggressively, and the conflict risks expanding into something far more dangerous. Finding the balance between those two extremes has become increasingly difficult, especially when the opposing side has no intention of fighting a conventional war. Iran understands this dilemma remarkably well. Instead of matching American military power ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft, Tehran prefers creating situations where every American response becomes politically expensive. A limited response may appear insufficient. A major response may trigger wider escalation. Either outcome places pressure on Washington. That is the essence of asymmetric strategy. The objective is not to overpower a stronger opponent. It is to complicate every decision the stronger opponent makes. This pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout modern conflicts. Smaller regional powers often recognize that they cannot defeat a superpower militarily, so they pursue another objective: raise the cost of every intervention, increase uncertainty, create political debates inside the opponent's own government, force policymakers to spend more resources than they originally expected. Iran has spent decades refining exactly this approach, which explains why American officials continue emphasizing two messages at the same time. First, Washington does not seek a broader regional war. Those statements are not contradictory. They reflect the difficult balance the United States is trying to maintain, demonstrate strength without triggering conflict that consumes even greater military and political resources. Whether that balance can be maintained remains uncertain, because history shows that once both sides begin responding to each other's actions, the cycle develops its own momentum. Every strike demands another response. Every response creates new political pressure. Every new incident increases the risk that one side eventually miscalculates. And when miscalculation enters a crisis involving one of the world's most important energy corridors, the consequences rarely remain regional. They become global. It is easy to view this crisis as a confrontation between two countries, the United States and Iran, but that perspective misses the bigger picture. Because every major economy has something invested in what happens inside the Strait of Hormuz. Oil exporters depend on it. Energy importers depend on it. Manufacturing economies depend on it. Shipping companies depend on it. Even countries with no direct involvement in the conflict cannot escape its consequences. Take the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq. Each has its own relationship with Washington. Each has its own relationship with Tehran. Yet all of them share one concern above almost everything else: stability. Their economies rely heavily on uninterrupted trade. Every week of uncertainty raises transportation costs, increases insurance premiums, delays exports, discourages foreign investment. Even governments that disagree sharply with Iran have little interest in watching the Gulf become a permanent battlefield. That explains why many regional capitals continue calling for restraint instead of escalation, not because they are choosing sides, but because prolonged instability serves almost no one's economic interests. Then there are the countries even farther away. China imports enormous quantities of energy that pass through these waters. India relies on Gulf trade. Japan depends heavily on secure maritime supply chains. South Korea faces similar vulnerabilities. For these countries, freedom of navigation is not simply a political slogan. It is an economic necessity. Every interruption affects factories, power generation, consumer prices, industrial production. This is why international concern extends far beyond military alliances. The world's supply chains are deeply interconnected. A disruption in one narrow waterway can eventually affect supermarket shelves thousands of miles away. The consequences do not stop with energy. Agricultural markets also feel the pressure. Chemical exports, industrial materials, raw commodities, container shipping. Every increase in transportation costs eventually spreads throughout the global economy. Consumers often notice the result months later: higher prices, longer delivery times, greater inflation. But the chain reaction frequently begins in places most people rarely think about, like the Strait of Hormuz. There is another group that receives far less attention: the crews aboard commercial vessels. Thousands of civilian sailors continue operating in increasingly dangerous conditions. Many spend weeks or months away from their families. Most have no influence over geopolitical decisions. Yet they are often the first people placed in harm's way whenever tensions rise. When governments exchange warnings, it is merchant crews who continue sailing. When insurance companies reassess risk, it is commercial captains who must navigate uncertain waters. When military forces increase their presence, civilian ships still have to keep moving. Their mission never changes: deliver the cargo, reach the next port, return home safely. That human reality is often overshadowed by discussions about missiles and diplomacy. But without those commercial crews, global trade simply stops. Which brings us back to the central question: who ultimately pays the price for prolonged instability? Not only governments, not only militaries. Businesses pay, consumers pay, workers pay, entire economies absorb the cost. That is why the battle over the Strait of Hormuz matters so much, because the longer uncertainty becomes part of normal business, the more expensive globalization itself becomes. And once companies begin redesigning supply chains around permanent geopolitical risk, those changes can last for years, even after the fighting ends. At this point, the most important question is no longer what happened. It is what happens next. Because history shows that many international crises are not decided by the first strike. They are decided by what follows. Right now, several different futures remain possible. The first is the most obvious: escalation. One strike leads to another. Retaliation becomes routine. Military pressure replaces diplomacy. The ceasefire remains on paper, but disappears in practice. This is the scenario financial markets fear the most, not because of one isolated attack, but because uncertainty becomes permanent. The second possibility is something more subtle. Neither side backs down. Neither side fully escalates. Instead, both continue operating inside a gray zone. Occasional military responses, occasional diplomatic meetings. Commercial shipping continues, but under constant pressure. This kind of fragile stability has become increasingly common in modern geopolitics. Technically, peace exists, yet nobody behaves as though the crisis is truly over. Ships continue sailing, military aircraft continue flying, negotiators continue talking. At the same time, both sides continue preparing for another confrontation. This may sound unstable. Ironically, it can sometimes last for years. Then there is a third possibility: a genuine political breakthrough, not because trust suddenly appears, but because both governments conclude a prolonged confrontation costs more than compromise. History offers many examples where bitter rivals eventually negotiated practical arrangements despite deep political hostility, not because they became friends, because they became exhausted. Whether Washington and Tehran can reach that point remains uncertain. The obstacles are enormous: years of sanctions, military confrontation, political mistrust, domestic pressure inside both countries, regional rivalries. None of these disappear overnight. Yet diplomacy often succeeds precisely because alternatives become increasingly expensive. That is why communication channels remain open, even while military operations continue. At first glance, that seems contradictory. How can countries exchange airstrikes while also negotiating? In reality, this has happened many times before. Governments often separate military signaling from diplomatic engagement. One demonstrates resolve, the other prevents total collapse. The challenge is ensuring that neither side misunderstands the other's intentions, because wars are frequently prolonged not only by hostility, but by miscalculation. One government interprets a limited strike as preparation for invasion. Another interprets defensive actions as offensive escalation. Each side responds based on assumptions. Soon, both become trapped inside a cycle that neither originally intended. This is why communication matters, even between bitter enemies. Not because dialogue guarantees peace, but because silence often guarantees misunderstanding. Today, the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of exactly this kind of uncertainty. Commercial traffic continues. Military forces remain on alert. Diplomats continue working behind closed doors. And every passing day raises one critical question: can the ceasefire evolve into a durable political settlement, or is it merely delaying the next crisis? The answer will shape far more than relations between Washington and Tehran. It may determine how one of the world's most important trade routes operates for years to come. When future historians look back at this period, they may not focus on the drone. They may not even focus on the American airstrikes. Instead, they may ask a much larger question. Was this the moment the rules governing global trade began to change? Because that is what this crisis is ultimately about. Not simply Iran, not simply the United States, but the future of the international system itself. For more than 70 years, global commerce has relied on one basic assumption: the world's major sea lanes would remain open. Disagreements would exist. Regional conflicts would erupt. Political crises would come and go. But the arteries connecting the global economy would continue functioning. That assumption allowed businesses to invest, governments to trade, factories to produce, consumers to buy products without ever thinking about the oceans that carried them. Today, that certainty no longer feels guaranteed. The Strait of Hormuz is not the only place where strategic competition is intensifying. The South China Sea, the Red Sea, the Taiwan Strait, even parts of the Arctic. Around the world, critical maritime routes are becoming increasingly connected to geopolitical rivalry. That means the debate unfolding today between Washington and Tehran reaches far beyond the Middle East. It raises a much broader question. Can the international system continue operating under one shared set of rules? Or are we entering an era where regional powers increasingly define the rules inside their own neighborhoods? That question has no easy answer. Supporters of the American position argue that freedom of navigation is essential for global stability. Without universally accepted rules, international trade becomes vulnerable to political coercion. Supporters of Iran's position counter that countries located along strategic waterways cannot simply be expected to surrender every security concern to outside powers. Both arguments draw upon genuine strategic concerns, and that is exactly why finding a lasting solution remains so difficult. Military power can influence events, diplomacy can reduce tensions, economic pressure can change calculations, but none of those tools alone can eliminate geography. The Strait of Hormuz will remain where it has always been, and every government that depends on global trade will continue paying close attention to what happens there. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire crisis. Military victories do not always settle political disputes. Sometimes they simply move the argument from the battlefield to the negotiating table. Other times, they move it onto commercial shipping lanes where every cargo vessel becomes part of a much larger geopolitical contest. The recent American strikes demonstrated that Washington remains willing to defend what it considers the rules-based maritime order. Iran's response demonstrated that Tehran still believes those rules are open for negotiation. Between those two positions lies one of the most important waterways on Earth. And until both sides find a framework they can live with, the world will continue watching every tanker, every cargo ship, and every military movement passing through that narrow stretch of water. Because the next incident may not simply affect one vessel. It could reshape energy markets, global trade, and international politics all over again. The ceasefire may have paused the war, but the struggle over who shapes the future of the Strait of Hormuz has only just begun. If you found this analysis valuable, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this crisis is only about Iran and the United States, or does it mark the beginning of a much larger shift in global power and maritime security? If you enjoy in-depth geopolitical analysis that goes beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.